Thank you for this opportunity to share my research. Let's begin with why I have endeavored upon a 5 to 8 year journey aimed at discovering and understanding the characteristics of subscriber-funded video on-demand services, or SVODs. At the turn of the century, I had been studying U.S. industry change tied to the multi-channel era, particularly how fragmentation of the mass audiences once attracted by the 3 broadcast networks created new storytelling about women. Upon completing a project that identified a new presence of female-centered dramas in U.S. television and the emergence of different types and stories and themes, I began to look more holistically and systematically at broader shifts in industrial conditions in the television will be revolutionized. I watched developments in internet video with skepticism through 2010 because although there was a lot of noise and experimentation, nothing was gaining traction with viewers. There was much pontification from futurists, but little evidence. So I did some other projects and waited. From the vantage point of the U.S., 2010 became an inflection point in terms of use and is when the viability of Netflix's streaming service suggested more lasting change. By 2012, it was clear that Netflix wasn't going to flame out, and this, along with Amazon's developing video service, made necessary a revised edition of The Television Will Be Revolutionized. There were also questions and issues that didn't fit in the frame of revising that book, and led me to begin the work that became Portals, and We Now Disrupt This Broadcast. Despite the deep industrial focus of my research over the last decade, I viewed this work as a means to an end, as foundation building necessary to address my core research question and curiosity, which is how do changes in industrial norms produce changes in texts and stories? The adjustments in cultural products enabled by industrial change then require investigation for the evidence of the cultural practices and processes that result. My research trajectory investigating SVODs has been driven by the implications I observed of the multi-channel environment in the late 20th century as being responsible for shifting the bounds of commercially viable storytelling. My suspicion has been that SVODs would have at least an equivalent effect on the fictional storytelling available in culture. I've spent a decade trying to understand the foundations of subscriber-funded video on-demand services because of how their conditions, or aspects such as their economics, technological affordances, and regulatory status, differentiate them from the video distribution technologies that have characterized our thinking to date. My journey into SVOD conditions led me to identify 3 industrial changes that affect how they operate and that distinguish them from the conditions that were characteristic of linear ad-supported television, or from the production of movies based on a theatrical release and a long arc of revenue through geographic, technological, and temporal windows. The alterations in these conditions, in turn, adjust the logics, the aims and strategies that inform the content desirable to the service and its library. Subscriber funding, on-demand accessibility, and the capacity of these services to permeate national boundaries and aggregate audiences at a transnational level rather than being transnational by federating audiences in different countries, as I'd argue is the case of satellite and program trade, are the 3 key changes. I have spent a lot of time trying to sort out whether one is more important. Pure subscriber funding did exist before SVODs, and on-demand access can also be coupled with advertiser funding to different result. In practice, these first 2 changes are mutually enhancing in the context of SVODs and difficult to extricate. I have written at length about how these changes have affected industrial operation, so I'll just do a basic overview here. The key implication of subscriber funding is an adjustment in the metric that determines success. Rather than attract the most attention, which is the case in ad-supported contexts, the goal is to compel payment. In some ways, this is more like the transaction norms of cinema-going, but here too there are important differences. SVODs seek ongoing payment in exchange for access to a bundle of goods. In practice, that leads to a greater diversity of content strategies than common to industries focused on compelling a viewer to pay for a movie ticket. But to be clear about why this is significant, the content that attracts the most attention does not necessarily compel most people to pay for subscription. The extent to which changing the metric or the goal of a video service leads to deviation from many of the norms that we've assumed inherent in the business cannot be overestimated. Subscriber funding leads to very different priorities, often more in line with those of public service broadcasters, particularly those reliant on public funding, because the business becomes about serving viewers rather than serving advertisers. Another key distinction relates to SVODs offering access to a bundle rather than single titles. A successful library is not built simply from titles that succeeded, as standalone entities. SVODs, especially those with general libraries, are able to service many different tastes with diverse library options. The bundle allows a range of goods, valuable to different viewers in different ways, and is a substantial divergence from the live mass audience of other services. On demand. Importantly, many of the features of the diversified bundle only work because of SVOD's ability to deliver content on demand. Being on demand frees these services from least objectionable thinking or building a business based on selecting the content likely to be accepted, though not necessarily most preferred, by the most viewers. On-demand services provide a much better experience of content for viewers and are also able to derive value from offering different types of content than likely to appeal to a mass audience. On-demand enables choice, of course. Sometimes we might still want to watch what is on, or not want to be troubled with making a selection. But on-demand enables a diversity of experience that services the discrepant needs and desires viewers might have. On-demand also makes experience a central consideration of a service's value proposition. Although most media studies conversations focus on the content, I've suggested that the value proposition of SVODs is the product of content multiplied by experience. Experience hasn't been a central concept in media studies until recently, because it was fairly consistent. But the affordance of on-demand delivery encapsulates many facets of choice and control that were foreign to video culture until the SVODs. Crucially, most SVODs enable viewers to consume stories at a chosen pace, rather than 1 hour once a week or daily at a specified time. Such practices are foreign to video, but have long been normal in our consumption of other media, such as print and music, at least in the case of recorded music purchase. In combination with subscriber funding, the schedule-free world of SVODs enables the service to simultaneously support multiple content strategies that offer titles that are most loved by a few, rather than consistently prioritizing only those concepts likely to be most watched. Finally, the on-demand capability introduces different mechanisms of discoverability and personalization that support those distinct library and content strategies. That personalization, as well as the content strategies, are driven by the behavioral data the services can generate. They are able to appreciate the tastes of viewers as individuals and clusters with far greater sophistication than previous data capabilities. In terms of national boundary permeability, obviously not all SVODs are global or multinational, but many of those that attract the most attention and that many are generally aware of do. The television and film businesses have been transnational for some time. And even though much of the content on these services originates from the US, most of it is not particularly American. but characteristic of a wealthy cosmopolitan set of norms that are meant to be universal, just as has been the case of the television and film distributed through other technologies, at least since the turn of the 21st century. Even though Hollywood films have long played around the globe, and many cable and satellite channels have reached audiences in many countries, SVODs differ in their ability to engage directly with consumers without national intermediaries. The drive to be transnational derives from features of economies of scale. There are not marginal costs to video goods, so the ability to monetize broadly is valuable. But because global services are unconcerned with amassing audiences for titles at national scale, as would be the case if you were selling ads to national advertisers, they are able to use global scale differently. The internationalization of cable and satellite still organized the business nationally. Regulators were nation-specific, and more importantly, advertising was sold at a national level. As a result, the globalization of these pre-internet technologies functioned more as a federation of national audiences. Instead, SVODs are more able to imagine audiences without national borders, rather than assessing the taste market based on constructing an audience in particular countries. They are able to amass audiences across borders to make content for audience tastes that were too narrow at a national level to be valuable. One of the clearest places to see this is in how Netflix services the pre-teen and teen audiences. This audience is difficult to serve in a linear system because it is relatively small, and as a result, linear services tended to try to service the preteen and teen audience simultaneously, or teen films were constructed to be attractive to some adults as well. Instead, Netflix is able to amass a large preteen audience with content designed specifically for them. There is genre diversity across preteen and teen offerings, where teen drama largely functions as a single program category in the linear ad-supported market. Likewise, there are distinct romantic comedies for younger teens, young singles, and older adults. Such a strategy is facilitated by the fact that success isn't measured by the ability to amass a sizable audience at a national level. Nation is still relevant, of course, in regulation and in terms of competitive dynamics and cultural norms. But SVODs have access to different scale strategies than video businesses that are global by collecting a federation of national audiences. Thinking about, some may say theorizing, the implications of these three industrial changes, and investigating the field of SVOD services, and particularly multi-territory SVODs that have developed and proven successful or viable, has led to four principal findings. These are explored in a variety of publications, some co-authored with Ramon Lobato, and many in a book forthcoming next year from Polity titled Netflix and Streaming Video, The Business of Subscriber-Funded Video on Demand. Several of these findings may seem quite banal. I don't disagree. It is also the case that previous norms remain pervasive and continue to frame our understanding of SVODs. And SVODs should not be measured against or in relation to services with different business models or those reliant on distribution technologies with different affordances. I talk about them as the hegemony of linear norms and the hegemony of demographic thinking. First, streaming services, especially SVODs, are not industrially like linear ad-supported television in the manner casually presumed. As such, they should not be first and foremost perceived as replacements for such services. SVODs differ from linear ad-supported services in key ways. First, they are not scheduled. So although SVODs do engage in circulation power in selecting titles for the service and in their discoverability practices, their ability to channel content to viewers is much different. And importantly, though they may channel you through personalized recommendations, we don't see the same scale of mass direction or some variation of agenda setting in the way typical of linear services. Next, they are excludable, an economics concept. That means they aren't openly accessible. This is different from past home video services. Broadcasting developed as a mass service, typically reliant on ad funding, because you couldn't stop anyone with an antenna from accessing it. Broadcasting is non-excludable. The protocols of broadcasting aren't inherent to video service. They derive from the affordances of that technology. The excludability of SVODs encourages their different revenue model, which in turn prioritizes different types of content and program strategies, as I've already discussed. SVODs also don't use public spectrum. Broadcast policy and its foundations differ a lot country to country, so this isn't universally significant, but is in enough places to note. For instance, the electromagnetic spectrum used for broadcasting in the United States is conceived of as a public good. This is the basis of offering licenses to companies to use the spectrum for public benefit rather than to sell it. And this distinction differentiates expectations of broadcasters from SVODs. It might be argued that broadband infrastructure is similar, and that in some countries, public funds built that infrastructure. That is an interesting argument, but it also must be noted that governments did not build that structure for video. Broadband makes many things possible, different from the fairly exclusive functionality of distribution technologies such as cable or satellite. Finally, SVODs require viewer payment. This means they are in a different economic market from ad-supported services. Economist Patrick Aspers explains markets as being defined by trade of a common thing. The fact that we now have an abundance of services providing video has created considerable confusion. Markets aren't determined by offering something. They are determined by what you expect in exchange. I've argued that seeking payment makes SVODs more akin to video rental services than linear ad-supported services, which again is something that should bear on regulatory approaches. SVODs can't exist without providing value to viewers, and I've argued that is a key reason that they should not be regulated in the same way as linear ad-supported services, just as the offerings of video rental stores weren't regulated in most countries. Another key finding is that SVODs vary significantly, even within the space of those seeking subscriber funds. It is difficult to identify a single market, of course. A lot remains dynamic. We've had considerable change in the last few years, and then the unusual situation of the COVID pandemic, which makes it difficult to derive much certain insight. The way I've been able to conceive of this market variation is through the metaphor of the slot machine. Right now, the marketplace of SVODs features 4 structuring characteristics. We can imagine these as reels on the slot machine, such that there remains significant variation in what combination of these characteristics come up together. I expect that variation will decrease, and a simple taxonomy might be feasible in coming years. But for now, there are 4 structuring characteristics. Geographic reach is the first significant characteristic. Options include single territory, multi-territory, and global. Of course, it is more of a continuum than 3 discrete variations. Technically, multi-territory might encompass everything from 2 to nearly 200 territories. And global doesn't necessarily mean everywhere, but a strategy based on being in most places, and particularly major markets. Geographic reach is important because of the scale that becomes available to a service outside a single territory, and the extent to which that scale enables particular content strategies. Library specificity might be best thought of as a dichotomy between general and specific, though here too, services can be organized on a continuum. General libraries offer a range of content. They are the department store of the SVOD universe. A general library won't have everything or depth in many types of titles, but provides a mix. In contrast, specific libraries are often based on a value proposition of providing uncommon depth of a single type of content. Specialty services won't be attractive to all consumers, but are highly valuable to those that prefer the content on offer. a level of desire that may lead to willingness to pay more. They are like the shoe stores in the retail comparison. They only offer one thing, but provide much greater choice than the shoe options available in the department store. As with geographic reach, the degree of library specificity considerably structures much of the business and content strategy of an SVOD. It also indicates how the relationship among SVODs is often more complementary than directly competitive. Just as both department stores and shoe stores can thrive, so too can general and specialty services coexist. Library ownership identifies the distinction between services based on owned IP, intellectual property, or a library of owned titles, while other services rely on licensed libraries. A finer variation involves whether that owned IP is bespoke or created specifically for the SVOD, or whether the titles were created over time for other television channels or movies for theatrical release. Distinguishing bespoke content developed specifically for the SVOD is important because services are able to deploy explicit content strategies through these titles. Bespoke content is a small amount of the content available on SVODs, and to date, only Apple TV Plus offers an entirely bespoke library. Many libraries are characterized by a blend of these attributes. For example, a mix of licensed and owned IP, as suggested by this slide that lists some of the most subscribed services in Brazil and captures data regarding their library size and number of commissioned titles to demonstrate the variation in the marketplace in 2021 among global or multi-territory services. Just to offer a quick overview of Brazil, the library size of key services, according to Ampere Analytics research, looks like this. Netflix has the largest library, and this size is typical of Netflix libraries globally. One of the other things that we've been looking at in library analysis is the composition based on country of origin. This is another dimension by which we can see some significant variation across services and across countries. We see Stars Play, Apple TV Plus, HBO, and Disney Plus offering libraries that are strongly based on US content, while other US-based companies, such as Amazon, Netflix, and CuriosityStream, have libraries that are mostly not from the US. Amazon's right on the edge of that. And then Brazilian services, such as Look and Globo, with the most Brazilian content, but maybe not as much as you'd expect. Returning to those structuring characteristics, as indicated, several services have commissioned titles for their SVOD, but such titles account for a negligible amount of the library in all but a very few of services. Library ownership delimits content strategies in crucial ways that relate to the cost of content the service faces and the extent to which it enables the service to offer a specific value proposition through bespoke content or simply through a valued experience. Although owning a significant library of titles is a considerable advantage, most services with substantial owned IP as of 2021 have built those libraries by making content for other commissioners or other competitive dynamics. As a result, predominantly owned IP SVODs tend to lack a clear or bespoke content strategy, at least in this early point in their development. The Ampere data isn't detailed enough to see what is happening in terms of the Brazilian services, but you likely know. My guess is that Globo's Brazilian titles are owned IP. Finally, corporate position is a significant characteristic in distinguishing among SVODs. Corporate position references how the SVOD fits in a broader company strategy. Some SVODs, such as Netflix, are standalone businesses. I distinguish those as pure play services. The owned IP SVODs are part of media conglomerates and thus offer a new means of distribution for companies with long histories in video production and distribution. These SVODs are corporate extensions that introduce a new distribution business to an existing video business, as in the case of Disney Plus, Discovery Plus, Globoplay. Others may be valued for more than their contribution to revenue, but for advancing strategies that may be revenue neutral or even revenue negative. Apple TV Plus and Amazon Prime Video hold quite complicated corporate positions. These SVODs indeed provide video, but it is unclear whether their corporate owners evaluate them with anything like the measures Netflix uses to assess its performance. These SVODs are part of a suite of products that in some cases may function as loss leaders or as part of a bundle of goods used strategically in support of another more important product. I've identified them as corporate complements here. These variations matter because they can lead SVODs to behave very differently as a result of their purpose to the company and what the company's goal for them is. A pure play focuses on subscriber metrics, while corporate complements might be considered successful based on entirely other metrics, such as number of Amazon Prime memberships or Apple device owners that upgrade to new services or products. A significant amount of variation can be found just among the corporate complements. These different metrics of success also explain various approaches and funding levels evident among different services. In time, these particular distinguishing characteristics may grow less varied and other differentiating features more pronounced. For instance, there is no measure of in-country scale of adoption here, because very few have come to be mass market services or subscribed to by a majority of homes in a country. The difference among services that are niche, say less than 25% of homes, significant, 25 to 50%, or mass, greater than half, in terms of national subscriber bases, may come to be a significant structuring characteristic. To move to the third key finding, Netflix constructs global audiences differently than linear and other SVODs, at least at this point. That in itself is something to be studied, and something I've been working on with Oliver Eklund and Stuart Soroka. But it is also a general takeaway, which is that we need to distinguish Netflix from other global streamers and not assume a constant strategy or aim across services, or even that a service like Netflix has the same aims for all the countries that it services. We have been doing library analysis on 17 Netflix libraries based on Ampere analysis data. These 17 countries account for an estimated 80% of Netflix subscribers. And we found that even though Netflix may have global subscribers, there are patterns to where it is highly subscribed and differences in its national libraries. For example, here we've clustered them based on the countries in which they are mass market services, notably only English language countries with strong cultural linguistic ties. These are penetration-based figures, not population, or not on households, so you can take that number and generally multiply it by 2.5 in order to get the household level. There is another cluster at 25 to 49%, and then those that reach a quarter of households, or less than a quarter of households. When we are thinking about cultural relevance, penetration matters, but we might expect subscriber numbers to matter more if we are analyzing business strategy. Another thing we looked at was the variation in domestic content in different libraries. There's a lot of variation, and this may speak to how Netflix has a somewhat nationally bespoke strategy. What the broader analysis has illustrated is that library size is now pretty standard at just over 5,000 titles, and 60% of titles across the 17 libraries are common. Almost half of that commonality is Netflix commissions. There are also clear geocultural or linguistic clusters that explain a lot of the remaining variation, and then, at least among particular markets, there can be significant domestic licensing. Much deeper investigation with nation-specific knowledge is needed to really make sense of these patterns and to speculate on what other services are available and in the market and how that might be driving demand. For example, Australia has very high Netflix take-up, but relatively low cable and satellite adoption. Frankly, the result of a high-priced monopoly that has little exclusive sport and there are few DVRs in Australia. So Netflix and other SVODs met the need of a market that wanted more than the free-to-air channels, but didn't find enough of a value proposition in what cable offered. This illustrates how it is important to bring market-specific contextual knowledge rather than just assume commonality of English language or culture explains patterns of adoption. A final general finding is that SVODs raise challenges for existing theories. The opportunity here is extensive. We need a lot more evidence and case-based work that will allow us to build as extensive understandings of the industrial norms that support SVODs as exist for previous forms of video distribution. We also need to develop theories about their implications. We need work that engages in big picture questions, that takes core theories about how we understood different types of media to work in society, ideas that were mostly built in a mass media age for linear and ad-supported video or windowed theatrical release systems, and instead consider how the industrial and cultural features of the 21st century require some tweaks and alterations. We need to move past the frame of is linear dying. This frame is problematic because it leads us to see the dynamic in a particular way. And we also need to not get distracted by the news cycle of the day. You know, Netflix is a gaming company, and instead devise systematic research agendas. There is much more change to come, but I also feel that I'm again at a point where I need to step back and see how things play out for the next 5 years. To be clear, it isn't that all media studies theory needs rewritten, but SVODs do warrant adjustment and rethinking in some cases. They need bespoke theories. In others, they might just require a slight pivot, and sometimes no change at all. I describe the work that I do in the book coming next year as setting the table. My hope is that my work conceptualizing the distinctive industrial dynamics is helpful for others who can spring into the bigger questions. The preliminary findings aren't my endpoint. This was just the work that needed to be done to get to the questions that really interest me. Where am I going? All that industrial analysis leads me to believe there is a compelling industrial justification for the idea that SVODs can tell different stories. The question I haven't extensively explored or grounded in evidence is, do SVODs tell different stories? That work is in process in a book Ramon and I are editing called Streaming Stories, under contract with NYU Press. We're working with a roster of authors with expertise in countries across 6 continents to develop some case-based analysis and evidence. I'm also starting work that explores the challenges and opportunities of drama production given the dynamics of the 21st century media industries. That work will connect these industrial ideas with actual texts and storytelling to explore questions such as, how do changes in industrial norms produce changes in texts and stories? How are those changes in stories important in cultural processes? And to what extent are storytelling norms contextually particular? I'm also starting work that rethinks the concept of flows and the primacy of nations in how we position audiences. For example, the collaboration with Eklund and Soroka that is out for review analyzes Netflix library composition and finds evidence that it is more a pattern of circulation than flow. Also, as I've suggested, sometimes investigating contemporary phenomena requires stepping back and waiting for things to play out. There is a lot that is too new to rush into, and we are at least 5 years from the industry sorting out what is and isn't commercially viable. We are at the precipice of some sizable changes, or depending on where you are, they may have arrived. From my vantage, far down the rabbit hole of industrial dynamics, the next reconfiguration results from 2 distinct pressures on linear ad-supported television. That business is being pressured by a softening ad market. Advertisers have new tools, particularly search offered by Google and Amazon and social media. Those tools aren't interchangeable, and different forms of digital advertising have some pretty big downside. But right now, that advertising is television's to lose. The other pressure results from the companies that make content prioritizing SVOD delivery instead of selling titles to linear channels. There will be significant contraction in linear channels. We are already seeing it in the Disney Channel globally. Viacom may follow if it can get Paramount Plus out widely. At a certain scale, it is just a better business. Linear is pressured at the domestic level too. For example, I don't see how Australia can maintain three broadcast groups with the available ad spending. Again, it is crucial to not see this as the death of linear, but a process of market adaptations to new conditions. SVODs offer a superior experience of fiction. That doesn't mean the end of linear ad-supported television, but those channels really do need to figure out their persistent strengths in the current marketplace and make sure they are providing something viewers and advertisers value. We also need to bring some new thinking to topics like media diversity, or at least position our thinking within the bounds of reality. Of course, more diversity in owners and services is desirable, but in some markets, Australia for example, I'm not convinced that having 3 hobbling commercial services is better than fewer. Also, they're all doing the same thing. Instead, media ecosystem diversity might be approached in terms of the number of funding models that coexist. Ad support, public funding for public service, and subscriber funding encourage far more diversity than a plurality of ad-supported operators. If I do manage to sit back from the industrial questions for a few years, what is it that I'll be watching? First, for norms to solidify among the owned IP services. It is just too early to know much of anything. Some may have many subscribers, but at a strategy level, they are still emergent. Second, I'm watching how linear and national industries reconfigure. I'm looking for first movers that recognize it is time for a new playbook and who change what they do in response. Appreciating the difference between substitutes and complements is key. I'm most uncertain of the linear cable satellite future, but the market dynamics are so nation-specific that it's difficult to discuss generally. Finally, I'm curious to see what characteristics prove sustainable and successful for specific library or single territory services. SVODs aren't entirely unprecedented video distribution services, but they are distinct from those we have known and theorized in some key ways. The SVOD sector, which is just one component of internet distributed video, remains strongly multifaceted with significant in-category variation. The preliminary findings identify the central distinctions I've observed, but much more remains to investigate, analyze, and explore. Thank you.